Welcome back to Moonstruck right here on Riot Radio. I'm your host, Ryan, and today we're going to be talking about the concept of light, particularly from the point of view of physics. So, light is something, as we know, we talked about in recent weeks, big astronomical phenomenon within the universe, black holes, neutron stars, wormholes, time travel, all of that. And last week we covered color psychology or color theory, and interestingly enough, this is all kind of intertwined with this one overarching concept of light, which they talk about in physics consistently. And as last week we talked about how the different colors kind of balance each other out in the spectrum, and how certain characteristics in psychology are attributed to each color. So maybe we'll go to the first image actually, and here we can kind of see the white light hitting a prism as basically depicted in physics commonly, where the white light hits a prism and then separates into all the different colors in the light spectrum. So it's the splitting apart to show that really white light is actually this unified form which has all these different variants within it. So when we kind of acknowledge that, we can kind of understand that white light is actually this unified form of all these smaller aspects put together. And interestingly enough, that when we look at the whole entire electromagnetic spectrum, which we'll come to later in the video, or in the episode, we'll see that this is actually a very small percentage of the spectrum, of the electromagnetic spectrum, and visible light only makes up maybe a fifth of the spectrum. And we, as human beings, actually only see 0.05 or 0.03% of that light spectrum. So it means that there's a lot of energies around us, electromagnetic energies, radio waves, microwaves, infrared waves around us right now that we don't see. So that really kind of gives us the perception that, well, our human perception, what we see with our eyes, is not the end-all and be-all of reality, and maybe that there's more under the surface which we can't see with our physical senses, but we know it's there in some capacity. I often say, and this is something I typically use for almost implementing that meditative mind back into how we look at the world, I say that the senses or the eyes are only for seeing what the consciousness already knows is there. So it's almost like when you get that intuitive feeling within you about something and then it transpires, you don't see it or have any kind of perception of it happening or it occurring yet, but you know instinctually at some level that this is the case, this is what's going to unfold. And I think that is almost alluding to this concept that we are sensing energies which we cannot always see with our physical perception. So physics gives us some insight into understanding what this is really talking about concerning light and its whole capacities. And as we know, this show is more than just the physical aspects of life, but we also go into a bit of the spiritual aspect, and maybe we'll go to image 2 actually. And here we see almost this form, this I guess etheric being. We often depict things like angels and in spirituality as beings of light, or the soul as this primordial essence of like limitless light and potential. And we can see almost this like wave-like structure around this etheric form. And I think that really alludes to this concept that light is based on waves, even though we can't always see the waves with our physical perception again. But we know that they're created from oscillating electric and magnetic fields, which physics tells us is the case, right? So again, physics has a limited understanding compared to the entire cosmos's understanding, but this is the conclusion that we've arrived at with our understanding of the natural world so far. So I think regardless of whether that is, the complete structure of what light is, or only some small insight into the bigger picture, we do have something to steer us on the course to understanding what this force that really, I guess, encompasses our whole reality and the environment as a whole is made up of. So, as we know, sun produces light, and it produces radiation, heat, and energy. It's a big ball of plasma. Produces ionized wind, which is also known as solar wind. And like all these phenomenon lead to actually life being able to live and thrive on the planet. And this allows things to grow, such as the plants, the trees, whatever. They perform photosynthesis, where they are using that energy to break the bonds of carbon dioxide and oxygen to help beings like us perform respiration. So light serves a lot of different purposes, not just from the physics standpoint, but also from the biology standpoint and the chemistry standpoint. So it's really this concept that translates into all aspects of existence. And the only places in the cosmos where light kind of becomes irrelevant is when we talk about objects that are so old and fundamental to the cosmos, like black holes, right? Which light is not really a part of. It actually is an absence of. Or like forms like dark energy and dark matter, which science is only now exploring, right? So a lot of interesting stuff about light is out there, and what the potential of it is to do. And taking in that all of our perception in the first place is based on that. Like, if we couldn't see light bouncing off objects, we would not be able to see anything. So the very fundamental aspect of our perception is really based on that. And I think that comes into almost what a lot of in the spiritual community, when they talk about connecting with energy in the field or whatever, it really deals with this concept of being able to first be aware of something before you get physical sensory perception of it, because light can form phenomenons like invisibility. If light is bent around an object or something specific information a certain way, that information can become invisible, right? So all of these are really relevant when we're talking about understanding the concept of light as a whole and how it governs our perception to actually perceive things in the first place. So I didn't bring out my mug today. I would have taken a sip of water right there, actually, to just pause and move on to the next topic. But essentially, that is kind of the foundation of what we're working with today. That this force, or this energy that really governs all of our perception. And going into other physics phenomenon that I'll elaborate here on the board. We could keep the picture up and that stuff. That's fine. So I'm illustrating this concept, which in physics is known as wave-particle duality, or wave-particle dualism. And it's basically this concept that essentially we have almost light in one side acting like a particle. This is actually a pretty big particle, but and then we have it acting like a wave on the other side. And the concept of this is that in quantum mechanics, this is kind of the way it views things, and why there's a rule in quantum mechanics that says observer must always be present to observe a experiment. And the reason why that is because the way that light behaves and the way the particle behaves in quantum mechanics is really dependent if there is an observer viewing it and how they are viewing it. And this goes into things like the double slit experiment, where they fire the electrons through the slits and it forms an interference pattern and whatnot. In any case, the point is that depending on how you're looking at something, the result of the experiment can change in quantum mechanics. And this is because when light has no observer on it, it acts as a wave. It acts as a state of almost potential, this potential energy. But when somebody is observing it, it transforms, the wave collapses, and the phenomenon is actually known as wave function collapse, and it transforms back into a particle. And the particle is symbolizing this fixed state at which the potential energy becomes solidified into a structured form of energy or information that is structured in a very specific way relative to the observer who's observing it. So I think when we kind of bring that viewpoint into back what I was saying before about, the light grants you the ability to perceive things and observe things that maybe you would not normally have perceived. So it's almost like if somebody is attempting to change their life in some capacity, and they go through life doing the same ordinary things, and then they make a decision that they want to change something in their life, the opportunity that they need to do that might have always been there, but their perception might have not been registering it. The light encoded information might have not been picked up because the brain had a different, it was focused in a different direction, right? So when we talk about energy, there's also this aspect of perception of energy, right? And that actually gears how the energy is not only being perceived, but how it's being implemented into the environment. So a lot of interesting stuff around the concept of light so far. I know this is kind of a lot, and it seems like a very fundamental concept. Oh, light is light, it's all around us. When things are dark you can't see, when there's light then you can see. But it is a little bit more in depth than that when we get into how physics views this stuff and how it translates into these big mechanistic aspects of the environment, such as quantum mechanics and relativity, right? So with that being said, maybe we'll go into the next picture actually, and here we can see the spectrum of the wavelengths of electromagnetism that I was talking about earlier, and all of these electromagnetic or forms of electromagnetic radiation actually translate into the oscillation of electric and magnetic fields oscillating perpendicular to each other. And we'll get into what that means in a little bit. But essentially here you can see the visible light spectrum that is in between the infrared and ultraviolet rays, and it makes up a very small portion of the light spectrum compared to its entirety. And this is how much we see in the light spectrum compared to all those energies. So I think if a lot of times if we start looking at the world from that perception of understanding that, okay, if we can only see with our physical senses or pick up or perceive or be aware of this aspect in terms of what our sight is able to pick up, then we begin I guess not perceiving, but being conscious rather of these other forms of energy which appear invisible to our physical eyes, right? And I think that that's imperative for not only what they would term spiritual growth, but just having a better understanding of the environment and the natural world as a whole, which is what physics is the study of. So we find really that a lot of these concepts overlap with each other when we talk about physics and when we talk about spirituality and when we talk about consciousness specifically, because typically it encompasses all those realms, and really everything that we have like been aware of or studied or invented from the very beginning of time is based on consciousness. And one of the most fundamental aspects to consciousness seems to be its receptivity, or its connection to this energy, light. So in any case, that's essentially the spectrum and how we can perceive these wavelengths. So you have this area in the middle, the visible light spectrum. You got on one side, which is, I guess, what you would term the red side of the spectrum, which is radio waves. It has a longer wavelength and lower frequency. And then on the other side, you have gamma waves, which have a shorter wavelength and higher frequency. So those are inversely proportionate to one another. So typically gamma rays are what are expelled from the sun when it's, well, I guess the sun is always on, but we can only see it at when the Earth is at a certain rotation, right? Which, is what we call a day when it goes around and it goes night and dark, or it goes from day to night. So in any case, that is the basic principle of these different wavelengths. And we'll go to the next image now, and I'll get into how these fields operate. And this is electromagnetic radiation, or electromagnetic waves. And if you see the X line there in the center, in the very middle, that is light. That really is light. Or at least the directional movement of light. And the oscillation is what creates this energy. It's a balanced, it's an equilibrium of this oscillation between electric fields and magnetic fields. And essentially, by these two oscillating, they create this high vibration state, or high vibratory energy, and that is what we perceive as light. And electric and magnetic fields are intrinsic to pretty much everything that we interact with around us. Everything in the cosmos has an electric field around it, and it has a magnetic field around it. And it wasn't until, I would say, probably actually after the time, or around the time where Maxwell and Faraday and all those guys were coming up with their experiments around how these things work, that it was actually started to became thought of as some kind of unified force instead of two separate forces. So that is essentially electromagnetism in its complete degree here, with understanding how these two operate. And one of the things interesting to note just about the science of both of these fields on their own is electric fields can have the charges separated from each other. They could have electric charges by themselves, positive and negative, and they can be in two separate places at once. You could space out the charges as far as you want from one another. They're not unified. They can act the same way as, or similar to, magnetic fields, but the basis is those charges can remain separate from one another if they so choose. So with magnetic fields, you have a different effect, where it's a unified system. You always have a north and a south together on a magnet, and it's almost this unified form where there's always a circuit of energy going around and around and around. And this is really the aspect that leads to phenomenon like the Earth being able to shield itself against solar wind or solar flares and deflect charged particles. So a magnet will always have north and south together. Any magnetic field will always have north and south together, and they do not occur in separation from each other. And if they did, this is theoretical now, that science has not discovered this, but the term would be monopole, in which you could have a north and south separate from each other. But science has not come across anything that would indicate that exists anywhere in the cosmos currently. So, little interesting facts there about electric and magnetic fields. So there are slight differences between them, but overall they're very, very, very similar, and there's only slight deviations in the operations of both, right? So again, both interact with charged particles. Typically, electric fields can be generally charged particles, but magnetic fields can be used to deflect charged particles or redirect them. So they almost form this this type of shielding effect, really, that can occur. So you can see this in things like the Large Hadron Collider at CERN, where they use magnets to direct the charged particles that are colliding in the inner ring of the accelerator. So in any case, those are kind of the overarching principles behind this. In any case, that sums up a lot of the oscillating electric and magnetic fields, which is a phenomenon that creates light. So creates that movement along the x-axis, which we see here. And just to be clear, the y-axis is the electric field and the z-axis is the magnetic field, which we can see in the diagram. And then maybe we'll go into the, I think it's the last picture here, or maybe there's one more. Okay, so just to kind of sum up and maybe go into how we can integrate this into our life. I was actually doing a video very recently where I was talking about kind of the science of consciousness, and I was saying that essentially we have the ability to integrate all these forms of information, but and like perceive it even too. But the thing is, like, it's almost like compared to, say you have a very interesting dream and you're like, oh yeah, that was very cool, I want to like have that experience again or whatever, but when you wake up, it's almost like that memory is fading away, right? And I think the reason why is because you have this aspect of integration, right? Which is, can you bring back that information in the fullest, so not just you understand it on some kind of conscious level where you've experienced it, where you've, say for example, seen the movie, but does your body understand it? Can you retain it? Can you bring back that information? And I think that understanding the process of integration in the body between like all these states, and where it translates from, physics into chemistry into biology, is really imperative to that, right? So if you even think about it, that first in the body you have, you're perceiving something in the environment. So that's electrical energy, which sends the electric signals through the body from the brain and the heart to when it senses something. And then that electrical signal will then lead into, essentially, I'm just trying to visualize actually this here. It leads into... it eventually leads into the cell biology, but okay, it leads into chemical release in the bloodstream, which makes you feel a certain way about what you're perceiving. So it goes from electric to chemical, and then it goes from chemical to biological, right? So the chemicals go into the bloodstream, it changes the hormones and whatever in the system to make you feel a certain way about whatever you're observing, and thus translates into things like the gene expression. So like things like epigenetics, that are what controls whether genes get expressed or not, and then that translates into the genome, which translates into the cellular matrix, which I would term more of, I would say cells are really suns, because cells, if you think of it, is almost a limiting word. It's almost representative of something that is cutting one off from reality rather than embracing reality. So cells, I really think of, are like little suns in your bloodstream that just produce energy and produce this form of potential, right? In any case, that is really the structure in which things go. It goes electrical, chemical, and then it goes into hormonal, and then genome, and then essentially the matrix of your biology. So, in any case, that is really the basics of how light interacts with our body, and how that one form can translate into all those different aspects. And the interesting thing is it can go back the other way too. It just needs an amount of energy inside you that can force that, right? So I'm not going to actually go into an analogy, because I think that the analogy might be more complicated than what I'm trying to explain here. But it's almost like if you have a bond, actually, if like, let's say carbon dioxide, right, and you want to split that energy, it could do it by sunlight, or if you have an electric arc, something like a lightning that produces enough energy to break those bonds, then you can separate that energy and move it back in the other direction, right? But the point is, it needs a very high amount of force or energy to make that go in the other direction. In any case, knowing that it is possible nonetheless is imperative for you actually applying that into your experience in any case. So that's really what I have for you today in terms of light. We see, again, things across culture with the light. They say the creator is depicted as light, archangels depicted as light, spirit depicted as light, soul or energy depicted as light. So all these different forms, and we can again see it with things like the sun on the planet, solar energy. It's the cleanest form of energy that we can actually utilize, and we can see that translate into kind of every area of our culture. So just understanding that is something so fundamental to our experience on this planet, and that it really shapes the reality around us, and creates our reality itself, if you want to say, is very I guess fundamental would be an understatement. In any case, this has been Moonstruck right here on Riot Radio. I invite you to follow us on DC Media Hub, so you can stay up to date with all the content that is being released. I encourage you to like and subscribe if you're watching this on YouTube at the channel Moonstruck. I do encourage you to follow me on Instagram at top_sorcerer. Check out my other channel, Sword of Mercury, if you're interested in topics like this, and where I depict it on a whiteboard, and you can see me do the illustrations of explaining physics, phenomenon, spirituality, and philosophy. So if you enjoyed this, once again, I encourage you to help support the channel, and we will see you in the next episode.